Hi everybody, macroeconomics example is fundamental in your exams to help you make your points, to help you evaluate in your judgment. It's an expectation that no matter what you write, you'll have examples to back it up for sure. So make sure in this video you write everything down. Your job is to try and memorize as much as this as possible. If you want more detail, go and research. It's very easy to find that detail. Let's go guys by looking at real life examples, determinants of aggregate demand. So let's start with determinants of consumption here with low interest rates. Countries with low interest rates, well the UK. Even though we've recently raised rates to 0.5% from 0.25%, interest rates of 0.5% in the UK are very, very low indeed. In fact, it's the same level we were back in 09, back in 2010, when we were in the deep financial crisis. So extremely low interest rates, a decade of low rates here in the UK. The Eurozone at 0% despite strong recovery there, and Japan in negative interest rate territory. Whereas countries with high interest rates, well we look at the USA, not high at around 1.75%, but higher. We know that the USA have been raising rates, trying to normalize rates in the USA. Argentina at 40%, a great recent example of a hike in interest rates in Argentina. To control very, very rampant inflationary pressure, yes, but also to control a big dive in the peso there, try and create more demand for that currency and bring it back up. Countries with high consumer confidence, we have the USA and the Eurozone, both growing economies, the USA booming, the Eurozone economy is recovering, and with that you expect for there to be higher consumer confidence as unemployment falls in both of those economies. In the USA, unemployment is very, very low, around 4%, whereas in the Eurozone it's coming down significantly, both drivers of higher consumer confidence. Look at countries with low consumer confidence. Japan and China come to mind. Why? Big uncertainty, big concern with Trump's protectionist policies here and how that can hit these economies. And that is leading to concern. It's leading to concerns with growth rates and unemployment rates, holding back consumer confidence. In the UK, we know as well, very low consumer confidence with Brexit uncertainty. Countries with house prices, we know that house prices being high can drive the wealth effect, can drive consumption. Well, look no further than the UK and the USA. Big house price increases there. Low indebtedness, we know Germany is very much a save to spend kind of economy, whereas high indebtedness countries, which can hold back consumer spending to an extent. The UK, US, Japan, heavily indebted countries here. Countries with high disposable income, well, the Eurozone, because of recovery, yep, higher real disposable income there. In the UK, we know that this year real wages are expected to rise as inflation falls back towards target. Nominal wage growth at around 2.8%. USA with strong economic growth, they're expecting wages to increase in real terms quite significantly going forward now, and Australia as well with high GDP per capita rates. Countries with low real disposable income, just look at countries in recession right now or that have been in recession very recently. You've got Brazil, Russia, Venezuela come to mind. Low income taxes as big drivers of consumption and then AD. Well, the UK, we know in the UK that the tax-free allowance has been raised consistently over the last 8 or so years here, and in the USA as well, Trump's tax cuts there also helping the middle class. It's not just corporation tax cuts that have come with Trump, he's also cut income taxes to help, especially those on kind of middle income groups here. What about determinants of investment? Well, we have interest rates are a big driver for investment here as cost of borrowing reduces, firms borrow and then spend on capital goods. Well, low interest rates, high interest rates, you've got 1 and 2 here. High business confidence, the US because of strong economic growth. The Eurozone, remember, determinant of business confidence is very much expected demand, expected profitability. Both countries' expected demand and growth is very high. And low business confidence, well, exactly the same as what we said before. China, Japan, UK, uncertainty with the impact of protectionist policies from the US and Brexit uncertainty in the UK. Low corporation taxes, we look at UK, currently at 19%, plans to reduce that further to 17% by 2020. Ireland, one of the lowest in the world at 12.5%, and the USA, yeah, Trump's big cut in corporation tax from 35% to 20%, quite a significant cut there, very significant cut, good for you to use. High corporation tax, why on earth have I said the UK here? Well, it's Jeremy Corbyn's proposed increase in corporation tax if he wins the next election in a few years' time. He said he would raise it from currently it's 19, but he said he'd raise it to 26%. To fund a lot of his government spending policies, to fund his nationalisation policies. That's the idea here. We look at examples of government spending out there, so countries adopting fiscal expansion, China, Japan, Hong Kong. Japan and China, as we've just said, growth concerns there, especially in Japan. First quarter of this year going into negative growth territory, recession on the cards in Japan. Not just yet, only 1 quarter of negative growth in Japan, but very much on the cards. So fiscal expansion, very much part of Abenomics there and Abe's policies in Japan. China as well, not stagnating growth, but growth below target for quite a few years now. So both countries looking at fiscal expansion with infrastructure in particular to try and boost growth. Hong Kong as well, infrastructure related. The USA, Trump looking at big government spending on infrastructure, on roads in particular, as fiscal expansion there. Whereas countries going the opposite way with austerity and spending cuts. Well, the UK we know about, Spain, Greece, Italy, France, Portugal, lots of these Eurozone economies trying to control national debt there. Countries, if we look at weak exchange rates to drive net exports, X minus M in the AD equation, we have the US dollar. A lot of what Trump does creates uncertainty in the US economy, keeps the US dollar weak. The pound is very, very weak as we speak against the euro in particular. The rand, the lira, the real, the ruble, a lot of these countries here, primary commodity exporters. And as commodity prices were falling back in 2014, 15, 16, less demand for exports from these countries, less demand for their currency therefore, has kept their exchange rates very weak and still weak as we talk. Whereas countries with strong exchange rates, we have the euro, not great news for many exporting countries in the Eurozone. The yen, very bad news for Japan, especially as growth is in negative territory in the first quarter of this year, and the Australian dollar. So let's now look at shifters of SRS, in particular looking at how SRS has been shifting left in many countries and why. So key drivers are high commodity prices. Where have we seen that? Well, we've seen that with the price of oil going up and therefore the price of fuel. Like in the UK, that's been shifting SRS left and causing inflation. Higher gas and electricity prices also in the UK, driving cost push inflation through SRS shifting left, and higher food prices too. We look at wages being higher. Where have we seen that? Increasing cost of production, shifting SRS left. We've kind of seen in the UK, we're expecting to see that more as the year goes on. In the Eurozone, as there is strong recovery there. In the USA, we're expecting big real wage increases there, driving cost push inflation, as well as later demand pull inflation in the US. We look at higher sales taxes. The UAE is a great example. The UAE, so Dubai, etc., those kind of cities in the UAE implementing VAT as of the 1st of January this year at 5%, a big increase in cost of production there, stoking inflation. But if we go back in time, the UK in 2010, with their VAT increase from 17.5% through to 20%, and Japan in 2014, that increase in the sales tax actually led to a recession in 2014 in Japan. Countries with weak exchange rates, we know with weak exchange rates, imports become more expensive. So importing inputs, so raw materials, semi-finished goods becomes more expensive, increasing cost of production, shifting SRS left. Where do we see weak exchange rates right now? Well, yeah, the US dollar, but that's not really stoking inflation there. It is in the UK, it is in South Africa, it is in Turkey, and many other countries too, but some good examples there. A very common exam question is for you to explain different causes of recession, and you need good examples there to back up whatever you're saying. So let's look at some key causes of recession and real-life examples. So take financial or banking crisis. We should all know about this quite significantly here, obviously. We have the USA and the UK going back to 2008, 2009, significantly, but also Eurozone countries that succumbed in exactly the same way, with banking crisis in particular. Spain, Italy, Greece are the three big ones that really suffered with significant banking crisis. But countries that actually went bust, I mean, Greece has gone bust, reliant on bailouts, but Cyprus properly went bust. You can also bring Iceland into that mix as well. Countries who raised interest rates, and that then led to a recession. Well, we had Russia, this was back in like 2014 territory, raising rates to try and control inflation, but caused a recession as a result. South Africa, back in 2016, again, very high rates of inflation. They increased rates around the 7.5% territory to try and control that inflationary pressure, but recession was the end result. And I said UK here in brackets, who knows? We know that in the UK there are plans to raise interest rates, get them back to normal levels, but what if we do that dangerously, too quickly, too high a level? Who knows? That could cause a recession in the UK, especially when there is lots of Brexit uncertainty at the moment. What about housing market crash as a driver of recession, a cause of recession? The UK and the USA back to 2008. Look at oil shocks or just high commodity prices leading to a recession or worsening a recession. Well, we have the UK. We were already in recession at both of these times here, but inflation was skyrocketing at both of these times too. So this was not good news for us. It kind of deepened our recession, but also stoking inflation, stagflation in both of these times here. Countries with weak exchange rates. Okay, so the very, very high import prices here, shifting SRS left and actually causing inflation. Even though all of these countries really are export driven, the weak exchange rate stoking the very high inflation rates, shifting SRS left was a driver of recession here. South Africa, Russia, Brazil, Turkey, Nigeria. Higher sales tax, we've already mentioned, Japan here in 2014. Falling commodity prices, yeah, for countries reliant on the export of primary commodities, if demand for them falls, and they're reliant on the export of these for X minus M in the AD equation increasing and AD shifting right and growth increasing, anytime you see falling commodity prices, that means less export revenue. They're in big trouble here. So Nigeria, Angola, Venezuela, Russia, well, these three are big oil exporters here. So falling oil prices means less export revenues. It led to big recessions in all of these three countries. In fact, Venezuela is still in deep, deep recession as we talk. Russia, big exporter of natural gas as well as many other primary commodities, falling commodity prices back in 2014, 2015, 2016, it really hit the Russian economy. Brazil, a big primary commodity exporter. Zambia, a big exporter of copper. Falling prices of these commodities, bad news for export revenues, bad news for AD, bad news for growth, driver of recession here. We look at countries currently experiencing stagflation. What's that? That's high rates of inflation with stagnant growth. That could be just very, very, very little growth or negative growth. Good to know countries that are experiencing this: South Africa, Egypt, Nigeria, Turkey, Venezuela, Argentina, all countries going through that phenomenon right now. Let's keep going, guys, more application. So we're looking at countries where you can apply the benefits of economic growth. Well, clearly China and India, it's obvious to see the benefits of growth there. To be honest, any example of a Southeast Asian nation will be fine here. So Thailand, Vietnam are great examples. Malaysia, Singapore, Japan, there are tons of examples down there which you can use. In Africa, you can use Botswana, a great unique example for you. You can even use Ireland if you want. Since Ireland has stopped with their austerity policies, rapid economic growth, leading to very high GDP per capita rates in Ireland as we speak here. What about the costs of economic growth? Well, again, China and India have seen all the major costs of economic growth. That's high rates of inflation, that's income inequality, that's the negative externalities, the environmental issues that come with economic growth. Nigeria and Angola, big income inequality problems there. Driven by, you could argue, corrupt government and one sector dominance. Demand pull inflation, where have we seen that? Well, in China, back in their heyday, early 2000s, with rapid growth rates, double-digit growth rates, demand pull inflation was a side effect for sure. The UK and the USA, we're expecting both countries to show some demand pull inflation as this year progresses, as real wages go up, and that feeds through to high consumption and thus drives demand pull inflation. Cost push inflation, we've mentioned these countries many times now. Weak exchange rates are drivers here of cost push inflation. UK, South Africa, Turkey, Argentina. If ever you want to mention good deflation, so into deflation territory now, but countries that have experienced it in a good way, i.e. really from the supply side, and therefore we just see falling prices and the benefits of falling prices because deflation is not long-term, it's short-term, it doesn't seep into expectations, it's not anticipated. So where have we seen examples of good deflation? Well, the UK, the Eurozone, Switzerland, this all goes back to 2015, end of 2015, early 2016. We saw very minor bouts of deflation in all of these places here. And that was good news, it was great. We just got the benefit of falling prices for consumers and for producers there. Whereas real-life examples of bad deflation, obviously Japan, since that banking crisis in the early 1990s, have had significant bouts of deflation, all bad news. Deflation coming from the demand side, becoming cyclical, becoming anticipated, becoming bad news, spiraling deflation. Same with Greece. Not many people will mention Greece here, but ever since the financial crisis, Greece have had deflation. So a decade of deflation in Greece, the same thing, spiraling deflation here. What about the costs of inflation? Which countries have experienced many of the issues with high rates of inflation? Well, Argentina, massively. Every single year I talk about Argentina and inflation just gets worse because it's spiraling. It's become anticipated, so we're seeing wage price spirals and consumer driven price spirals as well here. But also in Brazil, when they experience inflation, not now, inflation is under control, more so in Brazil now, but a couple of years back when it peaked at more than 10%, around the 12% mark here, it was really eroding purchasing power and affecting living standards. Even in the UK, we're only talking inflation of around 3.2% in the UK recently, but even that eroded living standards, harmed purchasing power massively. It also eroded savings as interest rates were so low, so good example there. Cyclical unemployment, you have to talk about Eurozone economies. Yeah, you do. We're talking here Greece with unemployment rates of around 21%. We're talking Italy still with the unemployment rates around 11%. We're talking Spain, unemployment rates around 16%. Clear cyclical unemployment. Even though unemployment is coming down, it's still cyclical unemployment there. South Africa with unemployment rates of 26% in recession. Structural unemployment, you can look at, again, Eurozone economies. Why? A lot of the cyclical unemployment here has become structural. A lot of the youth, as the main example, becoming de-skilled, losing their skills no longer needed because they've been unemployed for such a long time. So cyclical turning into structural unemployment. That's called hysteresis right there. But also look at India. Majority of India's population, in fact 50% of India's population, is a 25 or less. Incredible stat there. And a lot of these youngsters going to university, going to college, getting degrees in similar areas. There are not enough jobs for all of these graduates with very similar degrees, leading to structural unemployment issues. The skills that people have are not necessarily needed to that level in India. Similar, you could argue, in the UK. A lot of graduates now with very similar degrees, decent degrees but very similar, not fulfilling the need for skills in the economy. There are needs for skills in other areas, but graduates ending up with degrees and skills all in the same area, competing for the same jobs, is leading to large structural unemployment for those graduates. They end up in non-graduate jobs as a result. We look at examples of real wage unemployment, so countries where either minimum wages have risen or have been implemented, but also where there are strong unions driving wages up beyond equilibrium in the labour market. Where in the UK, increases in the national living wage through the Conservative Party here beyond the rate of inflation has driven real wage unemployment. Many companies now looking to replace low-wage workers with technology, with capital instead. In Germany, 2014, implementation of minimum wage for the first time, and Eurozone economies with very strong trade unions, in particular France, Spain come to mind, sticking wages beyond equilibrium, driving real wage unemployment here. You want to apply the costs of unemployment? Well, go no further than Eurozone economies, in particular Greece, Spain, Italy. You can apply pretty much every single cost of unemployment to these countries here. What about income inequality? Well, let's look at countries with low Gini, so relatively equal distributions of income. Your Scandinavian nations are your go-to examples. What about countries with high Ginis, relatively unequal distributions of income? A lot of African nations here, Nigeria, Angola, Botswana, South Africa. But if you want a more developed economy context here, bring in the USA if you want to, feel free. Bring in China, bring in India, also with quite high Ginis. What about countries experiencing absolute poverty? I've said African nations, I'll give you some more precise ones. You want to mention Zimbabwe, Burundi, Ethiopia, Rwanda are all great examples with very high absolute poverty levels. Very high, especially Ethiopia and Zimbabwe. Look at China and India. Even though there has been big increases in economic growth, large income inequalities are very extreme. Lots of people in rural areas in particular living in absolute poverty. What about countries where we see large relative poverty? Obviously we can apply to the UK and the USA, we know those very well. Let's keep going, guys, looking at examples of macro policy. Let's start by looking at expansionary monetary policy in the form of lower interest rates, so countries that have cut their interest rate here. We've got Brazil, South Africa and Russia. All of these three nations have been coming out of recession. Inflation is now more under control in each of these countries, allowing these countries the chance to cut rates and try and stimulate aggregate demand, stimulate growth here. We've also got India, throw them into the mix here. India cutting rates to try and stimulate growth. There's always this nice competition between India and China with growth rates. India's been dominating China for the past few years, and keeping rates low or lower helps to keep AD up, helps to keep growth up in India. What about countries that are pushing up interest rates? We can group these into two categories. Countries looking to normalize their interest rates, countries looking to raise rates in order to control inflation. So we have the US, Canada and the UK, all countries looking to raise rates in order to normalize them. US and Canada have already kind of done it, and they're planning to continue doing it. US interest rates at around 1.75%, Canada interest rates at 1.25%. Plans for both those countries to keep going, both central banks to keep going and push up rates back to normal levels. In the UK, we know interest rates are still at 0.5%, still at the rate as they were during the crisis here, but we know that there are plans to raise them as the years go on. Turkey and Argentina are raising interest rates quite significantly to control excessive inflationary pressure. Interest rates in Turkey are 8% right now, in Argentina 40% to control almost like hyperinflation in Argentina. Quantitative easing, so central banks here, countries where they're going the extreme way or where they have gone the extreme way to boost aggregate demand, expansionary monetary policy in a non-conventional way. These are all countries that have done it: USA, UK, Eurozone, Japan. Important for you to know that the US is pulling back, is tapering their quantitative easing, and that pumped money is now coming out of the economy in the USA. What about countries using negative interest rates? Well, remember, this is only the interest rate that central banks will lend to commercial banks. It's not the interest rate that we would get from a high street bank in these countries, okay? So don't go making that mistake. It's just that central bank interest rate, which applies for commercial banks who want to borrow from the central bank here. But Japan, Sweden, Switzerland all have got negative central bank interest rates here. Barely negative territory, but interesting to know that it's the case, and interesting to know that interest rates can be extreme, even go into subtle negative territory here. Let's move into fiscal policy. We'll look at fiscal expansion, so expansionary fiscal policy in the form of an increase in government spending. We know about these countries, Japan, China, USA, I've mentioned them already, but I've also put UK into this category. Remember that Philip Hammond has left £3 billion of money spare, just in case we need it, as fiscal expansion if there is a Brexit shock. So when we leave the EU, if there is a big shock to the economy, a big recession, £3 billion spare, ready to pump into the economy through government spending if needed. What about countries using or have used austerity policy? UK, Ireland, Portugal, Greece, Italy, Spain, France. Okay, the UK and all of these Eurozone countries are still using austerity policies as we speak. The Ireland example here used austerity policies, stopped around 3 years ago, very successful use of austerity, huge budget surpluses run, and now Ireland are being very, very successful with fiscal room and space to spend in the economy, to grow now in the economy with government finances much more under control. So Ireland no longer using it, they used it very successfully. So a good example for you to use. All the other countries are still using austerity policies right now. If we look at expansionary fiscal policy in the other way, so tax cuts now, the other side of fiscal policy, we know about the UK and the US with both income tax and corporation tax cuts. What about tax rises? Any countries using contractionary fiscal policies in the form of tax rises? It's hard to get really good examples of big tax rises, very recent examples, but ones you can go to. Australia, increasing the marginal rate of income tax for the highest paid. Good to research that and see what the idea was. The idea was to raise more revenue to fund spending on healthcare there. So you can talk about that as your example here. It wasn't really to control the economy or to reduce AD or anything like that, but still a good example of a big direct tax rise there. The UK, we're talking about VAT going way back to 2010 here. Japan, we're talking about an increase in sales tax in 2014. They're the best examples you can use if you have to. Let's not talk about supply side policies. I've already covered major UK supply side policies in my UK key stats video. I'll put that little section in now. Very good to know, such amazing application with UK supply side policies. These should be your go-to ones. Let's now look at the winners from globalization, your Asian tigers. China and India, yes, but also countries like Japan, South Korea, Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore. All of these countries have significantly benefited from globalization. How do we know? Rapid increases in HDI, rapid increases in GDP per capita, rapid increases in incomes and reduction in poverty. All great signs that globalization has really benefited these countries. You've also got your European exporters seeing growth from exports, seeing increases in incomes from that. You've also got your Gulf states, UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, oil exporters, FDI increases as well, seeing that driving growth, seeing that driving higher incomes. What about your losers from globalization? Well, your sub-Saharan African nations. It's a real shame, but it's true. Why? You could argue primary commodity dependence holding them back. You could argue corrupt governments is a big issue. You can argue protectionism both at home, so within Africa, and abroad, really holding back gains from globalization here. South America, similar issues, primary commodity dependence, you can argue, corrupt governments, yes, but you can also argue import substitution. A lot of these countries didn't want globalization. Import substitution they went for, never proven to have worked. And you can also argue that these countries have opened up their markets, their capital markets, to speculative flows of finance, destabilizing their economies. Argentina is a great example of that. Hasn't really recovered from their banking crisis in the 1990s. Opening up markets like that type of globalization hasn't worked for South American nations. You can also put in North America here. We're looking at America, Canada, put UK into this as well. Obviously not North America, but a similar group of countries that have lost from globalization, especially your lower middle classes who have lost as Asian countries have found comparative advantages in manufacturing, decimating industries in North America, in the UK, and workers in those industries have lost their jobs, have seen big falls in their incomes as a result. Nice example there. If we want to look at examples of protectionism, obviously we can talk about recent Trump tariffs here. So US tariffs on the imports of Chinese and Japanese steel and aluminium, they're the big ones. But also the imports of Chinese pork and poultry, the imports of Japanese washing machines, of Japanese cars, all have seen tariffs recently imposed. 25% on steel and aluminium, key stat for you to know. We can also now talk about retaliation, right? Retaliatory tariffs from China and Japan back on the US. China have already announced their retaliation, their tariffs back on US goods. They've targeted very sensitive US exports. Soybeans is a huge US export, but also things like Harley-Davidson bikes, bourbon whiskey, Levi's jeans. They've gone through these very sensitive exports. Japan have also very recently announced their retaliatory tariffs on US goods as well. We don't know to what level, we don't know what goods yet, but they've just announced those two, so great examples there. Let's not forget the EU. The EU is very protectionist as well when it comes to standards on the imports of primary commodities from Africa, but also in this big form, anti-dumping tariffs on the imports of Chinese solar panels and on the imports of Chinese steel, so big anti-dumping tariffs. China retaliated back a few years ago now, this is, imposing their own tariffs on EU wine is a good example, on EU cars as well. But EU have also very recently been found to illegally subsidize Airbus, $22 billion of illegal subsidies going to Airbus in the EU, found to be illegal by the World Trade Organization here. And that's opened up the door for legal tariffs for the US to impose on EU goods, and who knows what goods the US will choose to impose tariffs on here. But this will be legal. And this is a big thing for the US because Boeing is a major competitor of Airbus here. So for illegal subsidies that the EU have imposed on Airbus to have been found is quite a big deal, and a great example here for you to use. The countries with large current account deficits, we know about the UK, we know about the USA, great examples here. But also throw India into the mix. Ever since the 1990s, India have had large current account deficits that they found very difficult to manage and finance. Countries with current account surpluses, your big exporting nations here, trade-dominant countries like China, Germany, Netherlands, Norway. Norway, a big oil exporter here, but also Singapore with a large current account surplus. Many EU nations like Greece, like Italy, like Spain, like Portugal, all run current account surpluses. Countries with fixed exchange rates, great to mention UAE, not just the UAE, but other Gulf nations like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, all with fixed exchange rates to the dollar here. UAE is great, as is Saudi, because they were discussing whether they should move towards a floating exchange rate a couple of years ago. So interesting case. Put Bolivia in there as well. Countries with managed exchange rates, so periodic interventions in their exchange rate market. We all know about China and how they intervene. Donald Trump famously calling them a currency manipulator. Countries with weak exchange rates, we've already mentioned. The US dollar, the pound, lira, the rand. Strong exchange rates, the euro, yen, Australian dollar we mentioned before. Let's look at development now and look at countries who've used different approaches, different strategies for growth and development. So we'll look at market-based approaches first. Countries that have used market-based approaches very successfully. Well, India, through attracting FDI, very successful for them. China and trade, we all know about that. But we can also argue all of your Southeast Asian nations, trade-heavy approaches for growth and development. Very successful stories there. We can argue Botswana in Africa through the export of diamonds. Tanzania and Mauritius here, attracting FDI very successfully, boosting growth and development. What about countries with failed market-based approaches? Well, Nigeria and Angola. Oil exporters here, very, very successful with growth rates, but because of corrupt government, that's not really translated into big development gains, still lagging behind in their HDI scores here. We can also talk about Ghana. I put Ghana in brackets here. Big primary commodity exporter. What a variety of primary commodity exports that Ghana have here, but have fallen foul of protectionist measures abroad from the EU and from the US. It's held back growth and development in Ghana, unfortunately. What about interventionist approaches? I've said relative success and failure. In truth, all of these countries, you could argue, have failed. If you look at their HDI scores, they are way, way, way behind. Interventionism doesn't work. Where it has worked slightly in Rwanda and Ethiopia, it's where government spending and aid money has been directed into health improvements, into education improvements. Both countries have seen that to an extent, But the biggest problem with interventionist strategies, as proven, is that income growth is very low, job creation is almost non-existent. The big problems there of interventionist strategies, and that's why HDI progress is often held back quite significantly. And that's what the stats prove with all of these countries. But if we look at failures, Zimbabwe and Burundi in particular, authoritarian governments and mass corruption have meant we haven't really seen many gains in any of these areas. Income, health, education, nothing really. And it's held their HDI scores totally back, some of the worst in the world here. We look at Zambia. Zambia is an interesting case. Recent interventionism from 2010, interventionism in Zambia, when they used to be more market-based. Since interventionism, their economy really has stalled, and development progress is certainly stalled there. So a good example for you to use as well. So that covers all the stats, all the application, everything you need, guys, to smash any of your macro exams. Anytime a macro question comes, you've got everything you need to apply now and get the highest mark. So take all that down, try and memorize it all. If you want to research more of these examples to get more detail, feel free to. It's very simple to. And hopefully now this is going to be your road to A's and A stars in your final exams. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I'll see you all in the next video.